Mr. President, I've come to the floor this morning to speak in strong support of S. 3110, the American Energy and Conservation Act. I'd like to thank my colleague from Louisiana for introducing it, and I would also like to thank all members who are co-sponsoring it with us, and I certainly thank Leader McConnell for scheduling a vote on this morning. I'd like to start my comments by providing a little bit of context for why this legislation is necessary before I move into the specifics of what it contains. For literally centuries in Alaska, we have relied upon balanced and environmentally responsible resource development. Whether it's fish, whether it's our game, whether it's our mineral resources like copper or gold, our timber, our marine mammals, even oil that was used to waterproof ocean-going vessels. These resources have been extracted or harvested relatively lightly for thousands of years, more intensively harvested or extracted over the last 100 years. And this resource extraction has fed us, it has housed Alaskans, it has allowed us to sustain a life in oftentimes a very harsh environment, but without question, an extraordinarily beautiful environment. In the last 50 years, resource extraction has become strategically and economically important to the livelihoods of all Americans. Because we have carefully regulated our resource extraction and protected our environment, today we have millions of tourists from all over the world who come to Alaska to view nature, to look at the amazing landscapes, landscapes that are hard to find anywhere else in the world. And some might say that seems like it's a contradiction, that you could have resource extraction to the level that we have in Alaska, providing oil resources, mineral resources, and still have this be an amazing place that people want to visit as tourists, as individuals from, again, around the world who want to see an amazing place. So we have, in our state, I think, truly managed to balance that opportunity to access our resources while still maintaining the environment and the natural beauty that makes us who we are. I think many here are aware that Alaska is this amazing place. But what I'm about to say should not surprise people, should not amaze people. But a majority of the residents living in Alaska's Arctic, a majority of the tribal governments, a majority of the Alaska Native corporations representing Alaska Natives who live in the Arctic, a majority of residents statewide, a super majority of our state legislature, our governor, and every member of the Alaska congressional delegation wholeheartedly support oil and gas development in the Beaufort and in the Chukchi Seas. Now, I know that the President and the Secretary of the Interior and the team that are responsible for developing a leasing program for Alaska's outer continental shelf have all heard this support, because believe me, we have made sure that they have heard the support. So I am hoping that the news reports, just as I was walking to the floor here just now, I was asked by a reporter about the rumors that the administration will put off limits in this upcoming 5-year lease sale, put off limits, the Beaufort and the Chukchi. I hope that these news reports are wrong. I hope that they are nothing more than a rumor. I hope that the administration will see reason and that it will allow new lease sales to proceed in the Arctic, as is clearly the desire of the vast majority of Alaskans. But this is not the only step that this administration should take. when responsible resource production does begin in the Alaska OCS, the 96-year-old federal policy of sharing resource revenues in the states hosting the development must also apply. The Mineral Leasing Act of 1920 established this policy for federal onshore revenue sharing at a time when there was very little offshore production occurring within our country. That policy has not forced resource development on states that are not interested, but instead it recognizes that the development requires infrastructure that counties and state governments pay for. Congress realized in 1920 that we need to share the revenues from resource development to help local and state governments with the impact of these activities. And this policy has nationwide benefit. From the east to the west, from the north to the south. Just in the past 10 years, residents of Michigan have received $5.7 million of shared federal revenues. Missouri residents have received $30.6 million. Residents of Nevada have received $108.6 million. And I have full confidence that these states and these counties put those dollars to productive use, tremendously productive use, and certainly don't have any interest in giving them up, in parting with them. So what we are considering today with the legislation that we will vote on shortly is an effort to expand federal revenue sharing to federal offshore areas. It's time to do just that. It's time to expand the federal revenue sharing to our federal offshore areas. This is a matter of simple fairness. At its core, it's a matter of simple fairness. Offshore production should be no different than onshore production. And no other state will bear the burden of development like we will. Most will only see the end result of it. They will see the benefits that come from it, the benefits that come with affordable fuel coming out of the pump at their local gas station. That's what they're going to see. But those who will host that development, we bear that burden of development, and in Alaska, we are willing to bear that burden of development. So with this legislation, we have carefully crafted this measure to apply only to states where responsible OCS development is supported. And I think that's important to reinforce. We're not pushing this on those who don't want the development. The legislation applies only to states where responsible OCS development is supported. So if a senator was not interested in this development, what we've done is we've respected their view. We've left their state out of this legislation. And this is only about revenue sharing. Our bill will not open any new offshore areas to energy development. So those that would suggest that this is that Pandora's box, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the revenue sharing that will come to those who support the development in their offshore. It will not force any state to develop its resources if that state does not want to. So, Mr. President, Florida is a pretty good example here. Florida would see no different treatment after the passage of this bill. What the American Energy and Conservation Act will do is make our policies equitable so that the states that bear the burden of development are finally allowed to share in the government's reward from it. And this is true for both conventional energy, such as oil and gas, as well as the renewables that so many members of this chamber claim to support. So in addition to allowing offshore revenue sharing for Alaska and the mid-Atlantic states, we've also incorporated a number of priorities that I think the Senate would do well to approve. Some of these priorities are pretty important for us. We have a small funding stream to increase sportsmen's access to federal areas for hunting and fishing and similar activities. We've included additional streams for energy research, to reduce the deferred maintenance backlog at the National Park Service. This is something that so many of us have talked about, is how we get the funding to reduce the backlog at the National Park Service. Well, this will help for this. It will also provide for a stream of funding for tiger grants at the Department of Transportation. We fund a tribal resilience program. This is very important to us in my state of Alaska, to ensure that our Native communities have the ability to adapt to a changing climate and to invest in critical infrastructure. If coastal erosion is impacting, whether it's the water infrastructure in a place like Barrow, whether it's the need for an emergency evacuation route for a community such as Shishmaref or Kivalina, or relocation, this can help to facilitate this with our Tribal Resilience Program. We've also dedicated revenues to the PILT program, which has become a chronic funding challenge. So, Mr. President, if you vote for this bill, what you're voting for is a more rational energy policy for our country. You're also voting for sportsmen's rights, for renewable energy, for the health of our national parks, for better infrastructure, and for our Native communities and their ability to be more resilient and adaptable. On the other hand, if you vote against this bill, you are not voting to halt or even limit offshore development. What you're doing is you're voting to continue an unfair practice towards coastal producing states, and you're voting also against the priorities of thousands of your constituents. Those of us who have assembled this bill have respected those who don't want development off of their shores. Now, we would ask those members to respect those of us who do support development for our states. And we ask you to support this legislation. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. I see my colleague from Alaska. I think it is fair to say that not only is our congressional delegation very unified on this, the support from our state and an understanding as to why revenue sharing for Alaska and other coastal states who seek this development is so critically important, and I appreciate all the good work that he has done on this issue to help advance. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.